available than before. Yes, I know. But in order to do that, for example, anticipatory action could be the right way to go, at least as a model. Why? Because we all know from medicine, from our daily life, preventing is better than curing. Anticipatory action is, according to everything that we can easily imagine, also the first experience that we have, is something which makes us save money and respond faster to people who are in need. So anticipatory action holds a large promise. At the same time, of course, it doesn't simply go through like that. There is a need to discuss it. There is a need to conceptualize it further. There's a need to spread cases of best practice and also address very openly what the problem is. And we have problems. One of the problems is, of course, there's only limited funding and there are very fragmented approaches. Why are approaches fragmented among donors and implementing partners? They all have their own legal frameworks. They all have their administrational constraints. They follow different pathways, but they also may have different definitions of what anticipatory action really means. To share a little anecdote with you, 1.5 years ago, when I was still at DG ECHO of the European Union, we had one of our strategic dialogue meetings with our German colleagues in Berlin, and we had a long discussion on anticipatory action. We were all jubilant and absolutely exuberant about anticipatory action until about, after 20 minutes into the debate, we noticed that we were talking about two different things. The Germans had an understanding of anticipatory action that was not the European understanding. I think probably in hindsight, they were a little bit more right than we were at the time. So we learned from this discussion, but still it shows that, people have different ideas while using the same terminology. That of course leads to fragmentation, but perhaps more importantly, there's the problem of funding. The euro, the Swiss franc, the dollar, the Saudi rial exists only once. Every euro, let me use my own currency, that you put into anticipatory action may, and you can easily prove it, save euros later on in the process. But in the first place, you have to spend it on anticipatory action, which means you don't have the same euro for response. Unfortunately, you always find somebody who is hungry now, who is ailing now, who needs protection now, who needs demining efforts now. And then to take the decision that, no, we want to reserve a certain budget, like 5%, 10%, something like that, of your response money, which is in very scarce supply. And you all know, for example, that WFP almost every week has to cut food rations somewhere in the world. No, you want to reserve that money for anticipatory action. Is a tough decision. It's a very tough decision sometimes, a very moral decision. And there's another problem. Anticipatory action, as the name says, lives on the basis of anticipation. So how good is your anticipation? What is the basis? What is the set of data that you have for anticipating? Do you use artificial intelligence? What is your foresight system? How up-to-date are your data? We're speaking again about fragile country situations. If you look into the World Bank reports, they are all beautiful data about social indicators, about the economy and so forth of fragile countries. But when you scratch a little bit at the surface of these data, you find out that some of the data is 10 years old. How good is it really? And even if the data is perfect, we all know the world is full of, these Cassandra moments where, somebody stood up at the right moment and say, this is going to happen. Prevent. But the decision makers didn't listen. Then it happened. And in hindsight, Cassandra was a star. But before the Trojan horse went into Troy and the Greeks took the town, Cassandra was an outcast in her own community. So what is the link between your foresight and the triggers that would make you use anticipatory action and the decision that needs to be taken in order really to deploy your material, to deploy your stuff, to deploy your finance? How trustworthy is your anticipation? And could you get terribly wrong that you put, for example, like in a casino, you put all your money on the red field, but then it's the black field in the roulette game that comes through. How good is your anticipatory action? So lots of things to be discussed, which show that anticipatory action is something which immediately, I think, hits the mind, immediately something that is appealing, that is convincing, but then implementation may offer a number of problems, and in particular, needs and requires leadership. In order to do that, we need to discuss this. We need to come to solutions. We need to come to a collection of cases of good practice that are convincing, because we all know nothing is as successful as success. So if you have successful examples, everybody will run for them. Everybody will want to follow suit. Everybody will want to take inspiration from that. And I think this is a little bit also the task of the caucus, one of the work tools of the Grand Bargain, where a number of donors, implementing partners, NGOs, and so forth come together to discuss all this, discuss obviously these problems, but also lead the way to something very concrete. And something concrete means commitments. What we need is not only a set of definitions, not only a set of recommendations, not only, so to say, a set of PhD theses, we need action. We need action if we really believe anticipatory action is the right way to go. And action, unfortunately, in this world requires funding, money. So what we would like to do is not only to describe the issue better and show what works according to our experience, but also to induce, to almost lure players in the sector into saying, yes, on the basis of this, I take a commitment in 2025, in 2026 or so, I will reserve X% of my budget for it. I will work with the following mechanisms and so forth, and I will exchange and coordinate with others in order to find out how it works and how we can. So without concrete commitments and concrete measurable action, you know, it would be l'art pour l'art. It would not be, so to say, the level of effectiveness that we want. And therefore, we are very pleased in the Grand Bargain. I'm speaking here for colleagues in the Secretariat and my two fellow Grand Bargain ambassadors, Jamila Mahmoud and Manuel Besler. We're pleased that actually, I think of all the subject matters, maybe in addition to localization, that we are discussing in the Grand Bargain, it's anticipatory action that I think mobilized the biggest level of enthusiasm. Organizations, countries, donors want to be there. We are flooded, so to say, with expressions of interest of actors in the sector that want to be part of the discussion, so that we even now discuss how to kind of enlarge the mechanism that we have created to discuss these things without jeopardizing the effectiveness. The good thing is our caucus started in February. I had the pleasure of opening it. We are, of course, working together with many actors in the area. Caucus members have met quite frequently, creating really a vibrant and dynamic atmosphere. And we hope that this discussion today that you're going to have in plenary, but also in working groups, will very much contribute to that. We want then in October this year, again in Geneva, present first results to the Grand Bargain annual meeting and the Anticipation Hub Dialogue, which will both play out in that period. And hopefully from there on, reach the decision makers level, reach those people who take funding decisions and organizational decisions that we need to have in order to try out anticipatory action in earnest. There are not 1,000 ways to make our sector more responsive, more efficient, and more relevant for people in need. This is an approach that holds a promise, despite all the complexities. And therefore, we consider the glass as much more than half full and much less than half empty. And if you're going to give us some good arguments in the discussion today, you fill it even further. Thank you very much and have really good discussions.
Thank you so much, Michael Köhler, Ambassador Grand Bargain, for setting us up so neatly. That's a tremendous job. I think we all know now why we are here and what we want to discuss. I have the pleasure to have three more people who give us a little bit of an insight. Two are members of the core group of the political caucus, and the other one part of the Anticipation Hub. So I would, without further ado, ask please to our plenary, the panel, our panel table, Jesse. Jesse is WFP's head of early warning and anticipatory action. Just amazing. Then we have Alessandra Gilotta, head of the Anticipation Hub, as well as Sam Brett from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office as a humanitarian advisor. Please join us and give us some little remarks before we then start to make all of you work.
Me first, right, Matthias? Thank you. Great, thank you, Matthias and colleagues, for the opportunity to be on the panel, and to everyone who's joined us today, and to the previous eminent speaker for the excellent introduction. So I've been asked us to provide a quick introduction to the caucus and to set out really the problem statement and what sort of sits at the heart of what the caucus is trying to achieve, just so that it's clear in everyone's minds. As the previous speaker said, I would hope that most people here will be familiar with the broad outline of the Grand Bargain. I'd hope that some of you have sort of worked with it and are sort of fairly closely familiar with it. So I won't go too much into detail on that, but there's just two real points or sort of features of the kind of wider Grand Bargain that I will draw out, just because they're relevant to the problem statement of the caucus. The first is the sort of the caucus setup and the kind of caucus concept. So this is really conceptualized and sort of conceived of a few years ago as a vehicle to resolve specific problems and specific issues within a sort of a wider theme or within a wider area. So not just sort of advancing a broad kind of theme or a broad sector, but really sort of zooming in on, you know, what are the kind of the key political and structural blockages to kind of moving forward this agenda. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind, and myself, and I hope some of you others out there have been involved in a few of the caucuses and have seen the kind of the scope and potential they have to deliver quite concrete results. And the second feature really is that the caucuses, and in particular this one, really take this concept of a bargain that sits at the heart of the Grand Bargain as a kind of a key operating principle, right? So starting from the premise that we're all here motivated by the same mission, which is to, you know, deliver better assistance, better outcomes, more dignity, more life-saving assistance to those who need it most in crisis contexts. But within that system, within that kind of constellation of agencies, we all have different needs, different priorities, different constraints, and, you know, we have the donors, the UN, local NGOs, international NGOs. We all need different things from each other. We're all capable of delivering different things for one another. So, you know, how do we sort of set those needs and constraints against one another, and how do we sort of try to move forward together with an agreement that improves the ability of everyone to deliver that assistance? So kind of based on those principles, the caucus, with support from the Grand Bargain Secretariat, which was really valuable, and other colleagues as well, went through a process of defining the problem statement prior to the caucus launch, which was quite a widespread consultation. It drew in views and opinions from quite far and wide across the humanitarian system and sort of the AA landscape in particular. And the sort of three broad areas that sort of came out of that, which had been taken as the sort of the three prongs of the problem statement. The first is this issue of defining and tracking anticipatory action spending and spend. I mean, the definition issue is quite a key one. You know, there's a lot of definitions that are out there. Some of them have more consensus than others, but to have one that's really accepted across the system and could be sort of referred to and held in common is a key kind of starting point for moving forwards. I won't go into, you know, what we've done on this so far and how much progress has been made. I think my colleague Jesse will cover that. Linked to that is the issue of tracking anticipatory action spend. So how do we sort of keep track of what's being spent on this? I know this morning we had the launch of the excellent report, which does a very good job of, yeah, Matthias is demonstrating, as we can see. Very good job of bringing together these numbers, but, you know, how do we sort of try and systematize this a bit more? And that's obviously very linked to this issue of upscaling funding for AA, which is the second kind of key plank of the caucus. In order to upscale, we first of all have to understand what the sort of baseline is that we're upscaling from. So the second key problem area is how to increase funding for AA, right? Which is, you know, as we sort of said from the introduction, there's only so much you can do with sort of limited funding that's available now. So how do we work through donors, UN, the different kind of funds that we have to increase the funding that's made available for anticipatory approaches? Then the third kind of key problem area that was set out is coordination. We have a lot of good efforts in this regard. The sort of OCHA-led anticipatory action framework spring to mind as one sort of good example. But how do we really ensure that we're streamlining our efforts around coordination? I think it was again picked up in the report that was launched this morning. How do we make sure that we're streamlining these efforts, embedding it within the system, embedding it within the humanitarian planning cycle, ensuring that our sort of key planning documents reflect a risk-informed and a sort of a forward-looking kind of approach? So those are the three problem areas that have been set out in the problem statement for the caucus, and I'll hand straight over to Jesse, who will discuss the progress that's been made so far.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you said a lot more than's written on your piece of paper there. So, I mean, that was pretty amazing. I think, you know, and I said earlier in another panel was, you know, one of the great things about this work is that it's driven from the field upwards. And so a lot of these problems that we're talking about in the Grand Bargain Secretariat are the ones that each of us have been facing in our field level implementation. And when I look at sort of the pathway of anticipatory action over the last you know, many years, it's a logical step for us, because a lot of these conversations that we're having here with our colleagues in the Secretariat are the same ones that we had with our senior management in our own agencies. Well, how do we start to define what we're doing? How do we make sure this isn't just another name for activities that have been going on for years, and a new way to find some funding to fill a short-term gap? And a lot of that came around sort of this idea of what is anticipatory action? How do we define that? And so for WFP, that meant, you know, finding its niche within our already massive programs for implementing at scale. That meant sort of understanding the definition of anticipatory action, the targeting of financing. You know, where do we actually want to see these prearranged funds come from, and starting to make sure that common understanding was amongst our partners. And so as we've seen, as we've heard, this was sort of the next logical step for us to then start to leverage the Grand Bargain's colleagues. And then the idea behind launching a caucus, which was relatively new for me, you know, taking a subset of that community and starting to focus on these three themes. And that's what was launched, you know, just a few months ago in February. And now we're starting to sit down and have these meetings around what do we mean by coordination? How do we start to make sure that all of the new people, as we heard earlier about the new expression of interest amongst the new stakeholders that would like to engage in anticipatory action, how do we all start to move from a common understanding and move ahead without having to rehash or reimagine what we've already solved, maybe individually, but we can now share collectively. It also meant making sure that we didn't start renaming every piece of financing out there as anticipatory action financing, to really start to have a definition that we can all agree on, to ensure that we start to have those prearranged funds in order for people to plan as was mentioned earlier by Kohler, making sure that people have those finances available should a hazard potentially occur, whilst being able to contrast that with the existing needs. So we needed to be able to have, you know, these concrete conversations. Many of these conversations we're already having with our organizations. Now, as a collective group here, working together to start to bring back the best practices and how we can work together. And that sort of led us into the tracking part. You know, as people, as donors, our partners are starting to ask, you know, where is this financing going? How can I start to report this back to our citizens, our constituents, exactly how this is implemented at the field level. And so we have these three themes along coordination, tracking the financing, and I just gonna jump down, and the fuel financing, right? Are places at which we all have collectively agreed from the field that need to be addressed. And I think that this is where we'll like to see the partners within the Secretariat go. And that's the goal of the caucuses this year, as mentioned already, and where we'll see hopefully some concrete answers as we come to the end of the year. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And I guess following from what my colleagues and Jesse mentioned as well, I think focusing particularly on the coordination bit, realizing and recognizing that anticipatory actions, we see it as a bottom-up approach, as really bringing, you know, having the stakeholders on the ground working together in coordination, working better and more efficiently, to put forward those action in anticipations of hazard, whatever that might be. And so, you know, this is something that we do very much in the Anticipation Hub, something that we are really passionate about, you know, bringing stakeholders together, and how we can do that in a way that is conducive to the conversation, and also to the challenges and opportunity that we see in the field and in the ground. And how, you know, within this constellation, if you allow me to call it that way, of financing instrument, of initiatives, of new energies, and new buzzword and others, you know, make sure as we, as practitioners from the humanitarian community do keep a focus on those that we seek to support, of course, and to protect, and also most importantly, how we can work better with national systems. That those are really the ones that we see as really leading the conversation and the actions on the ground. And so within those consideration, how we can really work together with national disaster management agencies, meteorological agencies, hydrometeorological, and to really for them to play a key role and being the conveners in those contexts. And remember, it's always context specific and geography, and bring partners together to be working more effectively in a coordination fashions and being able to prove the concept and achieve more for what we have. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Jesse, Sam, Alessandra. Here we are now. So I guess every one of you knows now it's 3 things we want to achieve with this political caucus: tracking, more funding, more coordination. How can we do that? And we need all the voices to actually achieve a meaningful change and meaningful commitments through the Grand Bargain political caucus. So what we thought now, you'll not lose all of them. They'll stay with us, but not here on the panel, but we'll move out of the room actually together with you. We want all of your thinking, all of your experiences, all picking on all of your brains to really get some extra insight that we might not have been discussing yet in these core group coordination meetings. What we will do is we'll have 5 flip charts or tables of a World Cafe, but there's not much table outside, so deal with the flip charts. We have 5 of them, and each of the flip charts has one of our group facilitating a little bit. We'll be discussing questions around coordination gaps currently in anticipatory action. Where do we see those gaps for all the practitioners beyond among you? We will discuss how we can also extend coordination better towards people outside, actors outside of the humanitarian system. So how to coordinate with the non-humanitarians from climate, from development, other actors, which is amazingly important to really have meaningful anticipatory action that has a real impact and that can maybe also tap into other funding eventually. We have a 3rd question around the local coordination, local actors, affected people. How can they be better part of the whole thing? Doesn't mean that local people who do anticipatory action need to always coordinate with us, yeah? But the other way around, it's very helpful to have them on board to really understand the situations better and increase locally led anticipatory action. We'll have a table number 4, what can we actually do? I mean, we talked about the funding. What can we do, all of us, to incentivize more funding? What's about the quid pro quo and the bargain? So what can we do to say we deliver more efficiently, we have better evidence that we provide? What is our role in incentivizing other donors or other funding actors to give more funding? And lastly, what are the best practices and lessons learned that we already have from other areas of coordination, of cross-cutting issues? I was thinking about cash, because at least there was a grand bargain process that led to a cash coordination. Others told me, okay, is it already a best practice or is it rather lessons learned? But let's see. I mean, let's learn from all the places where we already try to coordinate across the usual sectors, clusters, and so on. All of that will be outside. You will have 3 rounds of 10 minutes, but I don't have to tell you to take your seat anymore because you did by now. Thanks for being open to take part in this little exercise. Thanks. I saw already outside where I could walk around that there was a lot of discussion, that there are a lot of colorful points on our papers. I'm now quite excited to take a little bit of your remaining time, around 10 to 15 minutes, to just get an impression of the different groups on what has been the main points that you discussed on the different questions. We will not have any kind of exhaustive go through the discussions that you had, but I would ask either someone who volunteered or the facilitator of the different groups to just give us a 1-minute pitch on the main outcomes of what you have discussed. And I'll leave it to you, first one from the in-person audience or facilitators to start. You, whoever of you can decide. Jesse, Sam, Ben. All right,
Okay,
it will be Sam.
So it is me. Okay, thanks, Jesse. I couldn't find anyone to volunteer to read it out, so shame on you all, but you couldn't read my writing anyway, so it doesn't make any difference. So great, so we had some really good discussions in this one. It's a really important question, I think. I think it's really good we managed to bring out this angle of local and natural actors. I'll try and sort of categorize a bit. I won't sort of read everything out because that would just be really boring. As you can see, we went sort of a hybrid approach of writing them down and then using these because I didn't realize you were meant to use these. But there's a few sort of key kind of areas or sort of categories of stuff, I guess, that kind of really stood out. The first was quite sort of pragmatic, just on sort of the access to funding and how we get funding to local and natural actors, which is obviously an issue across the entire sort of sector and you know, sort of really sits at the heart of a lot of what the Grand Bargain is trying to do. You know, interestingly, somebody brought out just to fulfill the Grand Bargain commitment of 25% of funding local and natural actors. You know, just doing that in and of itself would have an impact here. Some of the things that came out in that regard were sort of more use of network-based funding models. I think a colleague from the START network mentioned that. You know, linking sort of community groups, community sort of insurance pools with kind of more sort of funding models, better use of pooled funds, trying to sort of make pooled funds more accessible to kind of local organizations and local groups. And then just sort of, you know, creating kind of different funding models that the local and national actors can access a bit more easily. Sort of another set of things that came out was sort of strengthening the use of local knowledge and how we sort of systematize local knowledge into the kind of humanitarian system a bit more. So rather than coming down with sort of very sort of top heavy, you know, triggers and kind of indicators that are set in, you know, capital cities and whatnot, and sort of use satellites, but to really sort of use local knowledge, use quite qualitatively based knowledge, how we sort of bring that into the system more and sort of translate it into a way that it can be used to sort of set triggers and to identify when they're triggered, and some very practical steps around that as well. So, you know, working more in local languages and sort of very local languages. That links a bit to the session that was in here just before this session, where Clear Global spoke really well on that. Actually, I thought it was really interesting. Link into AAP better, so how we sort of build bridges between the anticipatory action and AAP kind of worlds, and sort of make sure that we're really being participatory in anticipatory action approaches. And some sort of other sort of really interesting things about sort of, you know, expanding the evidence base on the use of local actors and how we sort of systematize that a bit more. So those were the key kind of two groups that came out. I thought some other interesting kind of specific points. One was on when we're looking at the coordination model. I've written limit coordination. This is maybe a bit of a contentious point, but you know, sort of making sure that we, as in like the international humanitarian system, quote unquote, are not kind of muscling into all the different areas where AA is taking place, and where, you know, there could well be already quite good local coordination happening through formal or informal groups, through natural disaster management agencies or community-based organizations, and to make sure we're not kind of muscling into that and obliterating all of that and coming in with sort of very bureaucratic approach that might not work or might be duplicative. So, you know, to almost limit the coordination model that we come up with and sort of make sure that we're taking account of what exists already. I think that's kind of covered most of them, so I'll stop there in the interest of time. But if anybody else wants to come and have a look, some really interesting stuff there, and it was a really good discussion. Thank you.
So the other Jesse, is there any volunteer from the online breakout rooms that could give us a short insight of a 1-minute pitch?
I think, unfortunately, there's no volunteer, but I'm happy to do so.
Perfect.
Okay, so we were talking about coordination gaps and how to overcome them. And one of the colleagues in the room mentioned that we should actually enhance the role of local or national governments and provide them leadership space to coordinate AA initiatives in their country. Another comment was on having better mainstreaming in place, so really mainstream approaches and mechanisms Also, information sharing was mentioned in our group. There are a lot of organizations that actually want to start the journey and also kickstart their own anticipatory action frameworks, but lack the information. So there might be coordination systems already in place, but they are not well communicated. We talked about the importance of platforms like the Anticipation Hub, but nevertheless also of the importance to have also other regular coordination mechanisms and bodies in place, maybe led by OCHA, maybe by others, and then have them also really on country and regional level to help those practitioners to interchange on lessons learned and use this to inform their anticipatory action framework developments at country level. The second question was on how can we incentivize donors to finance anticipatory action. We all agreed that we need to work on having a really strong evidence-based advocacy. We also would need to have good systems in place in country and agreed systems to give donors the incentive to finance anticipatory action. This comes along with actually actionable and creditable forecasts. The better and more efficient and reliable our forecasts are, and the less there is the the probability of acting in vain, the more convinced donors might be to actually invest in anticipatory action. Also stressing out that it's not only a matter of costs and being more efficient and fast, but really also emphasizing on that anticipatory action is a more dignified way to support communities, could also really speak for the approach and financing it. And this comes along with involving communities and their voices when we advocate for anticipatory action financing. I think this is what we came up with.
Thanks a lot, Jessica. And I feel challenged by having 3 Jessies now with whom I communicate at the same meeting. So maybe coming back to the room on site here, and another Jessie. Jessie, you want to go on with the next group?
I can go quick.
Yes, please do.
10 minutes. I mean, we got to get through all of these, right? So
Indeed.
Where did mine go? Oh, here. Yeah, I wasn't a very popular place, but we had these really boutique conversations, which was kind of nice. But essentially, what we started discussing was the importance of having a common vision and alignment of incentives amongst the non-humanitarian actors, being able to communicate, effectively with folks that are not maybe so well versed in anticipatory action in terms of exactly what we want to see happen. So when we're talking with private sector, it's not about just asking for more financing, but asking how their tech support can be utilized in some of the things that we're trying to do, whether it's with evidence or targeting or whatever it might be around early warnings, making sure that we can have those kind of communications in a language. And someone mentioned like speaking to a child or somebody in a kindergarten, being very clear on what we want beyond just the talking points. And that also was reflected in terms of development partners and other stakeholders to make sure that we've carved out enough space. And I think Sam had mentioned as well, not muscling into these areas, but making sure we've carved out a space in terms of saying exactly what we need from them in order to support the sort of greater good of what we're trying to do under anticipatory action. And also there was a comment around a tiny bit of financing that may be needed in order to make sure that the work that comes with this is not falling on top of people's, especially when we're speaking of national governments or local NGOs, making sure, it's a tiny amount of money, but making sure that it's available for them to engage in this in a sustainable way. And it's not just piling on top of them as we come in with these new ideas and new ways of working. So yeah, maybe I keep it quick there.
Perfect. Thanks, Jesse. And just to reassure everyone who discussed, we take all of that and included in our further or future discussions on the grand bargain. So even if we don't capture every single point right now, it will certainly not be lost. So back to online from Geneva to Berlin. Marie, please.
Thank you. I believe you can hear me. So with our group, we were actively discussing question number 2 and question number 5, which were both around coordination. And I think maybe to summarize up front, I think it was kind of challenging to come up with points that were specific for the Grand Bargain members and not entirely for the anticipatory action field as well. So maybe that as a caveat, but we were really trying to make the points as relevant as possible for the Grand Bargain members. And regarding the coordination with non-humanitarian actors, there were many mentioned that are non-humanitarian actors with whom more coordination should be done, but also a word of caution that given that anticipatory action is kind of trending and everyone wants to be involved in it, we also need to be careful to not get lost in coordination and coordinate with everyone, and because it can be challenging to see whom we want to focus on. Also, there was definitely the call for not another coordination body that would be Grand Bargain anticipatory action specific. Another point that was raised here is that if there is a lack of coordination, it could also be lead to a lack of sustainabilities of early action protocols that are currently being developed, and then maybe just valid for a short period of time. So that is also something that needs to be that we should keep in mind, that the integration of early action protocols, especially if they are small and have a smaller budget, into more sustainable systems like governmental systems is very relevant. Also, given that there's a lot of overlap with different financial initiatives like the Charter, the Caucus, Sendai Framework, that may be something that the Grand Bargain members could take into consideration, is seeing how these different packages of finance can be linked more efficiently. And one point that is kind of a transition from question number 2 to question number 5, which is more on what kind of practices we can maybe learn from in terms of coordination, is that the approach of having no regrets is something that is actually quite challenging for some of the governments in which countries we do implement anticipatory action, which is raised quite often. So here there would be a need for coordinated advocacy and policy messages around this no regrets approach. Now leading over to question number 5 is that how to do so and how to use maybe also experiences from the past, is that if there are any impact evaluations that show positive impact of research and activity, may it be anticipatory or in a more in somewhere else in the disaster risk management cycle, that these could also be used to convince governments of this no regrets approach, that the actions were actually helpful for communities. An example here that was given was for cash during COVID-19. Using these kind of examples, how this helped save lives and livelihoods, can also be helpful in then convincing governments of the no regrets policy within anticipatory action, as long as there's still a lack of evidence. Handing over back to the room, I guess.
Thanks, Marie. We lost you for a second, but that was not on you, but on us. But we heard most of it, and I'm actually caught in between at the moment, valuing all your input and your content and valuing your free time in the evening. I am tempted to go for the input and the content, so I'm just handing over to the next group in the room, Michel, Pankaj, Michel.
I am Michel from Save the Children, and we are Save the Children part of a core group of the Caucus on Anticipatory Action. First of all, many thanks, Matthias, for organizing a great session, interactive sessions. Many thanks to all the colleagues also of the Anticipatory Action. What we discussed, and it was a discussion facilitated by Pankaj and myself, was how can we convince donors to invest more money in anticipatory action? And basically, I think we came with a tagline, which is anticipatory action is about saving lives better. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And it's also about saving livelihood before we have to save life. Something which came very strongly, and I think it was the last point of Marie online, was we need better data and better evidence of showing the impact of anticipatory action. And I think we have anecdotal evidence, but we don't have systematic evidences of how anticipatory action, in fact, have a huge impact, can mitigate a crisis or can avert a crisis. So that's something which came out through the three group discussion we had. So data and evidence. Showing also the quality of the outcome of a response if we act in advance, and if we act, in an anticipatory way, is something also we need to do better. We spoke also about coordination and also how we can include anticipatory action in humanitarian response plan, something which have been discussed quite a lot for a long time, but something where we are not yet where we would like to be in terms of making sure that when humanitarian response plans are being developed, we can see anticipatory action as a core part of the humanitarian response plan. And then we spoke a lot about, and linking with, role of national actors, how can we make sure that also in the development of anticipatory action strategies, we have participation of national actors, national governments, and national communities. We leave it here because I know we are short of time.
Thank you. Again, very pertinent points, and we'll be happy to take on all of those. So I am going back to online one last time and would ask Michelle, could you give us some insights and a short snapshot of your discussions?
Yeah, thank you. And well, so I'm also Michelle, but I'm Michelle van den Berg from Oxfam, Anticipatory Action Advisor. In our group, we discussed question 3, how can the Grand Bargain support an equitable role for local and national actors and affected communities in anticipatory action? And I think a lot of our discussion or conversation really was on how we agreed that anticipatory action will also need to build on existing government systems, whether that's early warning systems or also on the modalities side, looking at, for example, the existing social safety nets that could provide an entry point as well. We also acknowledge that a lot of the conversations around anticipatory action, also as part of the Grand Bargain, look at the anticipatory financing side and maybe less at the build side of anticipatory action. And that it may also be relevant to when we unpack this question on the role of for local and national actors, that to maybe step away slightly also from the donor side to also look from a local national actors perspective at the question. We talked about potential partnerships with local institutions, whether that's on, for example, the research side, but also as part of this, recognize the challenges with data availability, which would then impact forecasting capacities, and where the international actors do step in on data availability, make sure that there's also a clear plan as to how that information and knowledge can then be transferred to local and national actors at the longer term. Also a point around ensuring that there is a voice of people affected by crisis that is heard in the conversations around anticipatory action. And one of the points here is also linked to investing in the leaders of tomorrow, and especially working with nationals and national citizens in the places where we work, local leaders, leaders working for local civil society organizations, etc. We briefly also mentioned or acknowledged who has a seat at the table when it comes to anticipatory action. And honestly, it's mostly those actors that also bring money to the table. But how do we make sure that also the first responders or implementers can be heard when we're talking and discussing anticipatory action and planning for it in terms of moving forward? And we had a brief comment around triggers. First of all, the role of local experts in determining the triggers, but also triggering action at a national level. So, for example, country level versus also triggers for action at a very localized level, and how those are different sides of anticipatory action as well. We didn't really have time to discuss any of the extra questions, but also just one observation that I wanted to share is also around a comment from one of our participants that observed that anticipatory action used to sit more on the development side, but now in the last couple of years, there seems to be more awareness and inclusivity of anticipatory action within the humanitarian sector as well. We thought that one of the explanations for that could be around anticipatory action also being focused on saving lives and livelihoods, and how that really provides that linkage between development and humanitarian sides of our. So I'll stop here. Over to you, Matthias.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And it was great because I saw already the fear of missing out, FOMO, here in the room, because there were extra questions online and the people in the room did not see them yet. But those extra questions are actually at the door when you go out. And if you want to, you can still put something down on your expectations. I would welcome you or would love you to do that. But before that, we have two more groups here inside in person. Please, Alessandra, one more pitch.
Very briefly, because a lot has already been, I think, mentioned in the various groups, whether here in person or online. And so probably, I think one element that is true, that it's real, and we talked about, it's about having that many, actually proliferations of many regional, national subgroup, and how we can foster them in a way, make sense and bring clarity. So then organizations, stakeholders, they know where to go and what those all different groups could be and are. We talked about, which I think it's interesting, and maybe I mentioned this one because it wasn't necessarily touched upon. We talked about coordinations and definitely we were discussing about setting standards for anticipatory action, what could be good enough, particularly in fragile settings where there is not really much stability in which organizations, stakeholders can operate, vis-a-vis, where we see also the grand bargain could help play a role in helping develop commonly agreed technical standard of anticipatory action at national and international level. It's something that I think practitioners are very much looking forward to as an enabler. I think it has been already mentioned, the linkages between the humanitarian coordination side of things and how anticipatory action might fit into that or not, or what would be, the good place for that to take place. We talked about donor fragmentation. I think someone already mentioned it, probably the previous group, and how we can, and I think for me also, it's an important one, how we can bring how we can support, let's say, national authorities to bring all the stakeholders together, and how the ground bargain could help facilitate that. We talked about country pool fund mechanism, coordination of financing module at national level. We talked about as well, touched upon, the nuances of working definition and terminologies, in relation and with local authorities. And this all part that it's still there, but I want perhaps just right here and now spend much time, which is all about sensitivities around anticipatory action in conflict setting, how we go about it, the intersectionalities of lack of practice in these areas in conflict-induced country, which oftentimes tend to be as well having different level of fragilities, appreciating and understanding that the sensitivity of the topic in itself, and how practitioners might go about looking at this specifically. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Alessandra. We are increasing our big amount of food for thought, and that's great. And last but by no means least, Ben from Risk Informed Early Action and Partnership, please.
Thanks, Matthias. Hi, everyone. I'm Ben from REAP, and I realise that I'm the last one between you and your evening, so I'm going to go on a filibuster, keep you here all night. Okay, let me give you 3 highlights, some really good contributions from the people who came to our table. Number 1 highlight, what can the grand bargain do for anticipatory action like it's done for other thematic areas like cash and voucher assistance? Number 1, how can we flip it round from being why anticipatory action to why not anticipatory action? That's what happened with cash. How can we reach that tipping point with grand bargain giving some extra push? Number 2, governments really need to be in the driving seat, and therefore these approaches need to integrate into DRM strategies. And that speaks to Jesse Mason's group, who are talking about how can we educate other people to understand anticipatory action. I guess we also need to educate ourselves as the humanitarian sector. You know, how do we communicate effectively with development, climate, private sector actors as well? It's not all about getting them to understand us. Finally, avoid creating a new sector or a new silo. So as has happened with other areas, you know, a whole new silo is created. How can we avoid doing that? I was speaking with Cash colleagues a couple of weeks ago in the Red Cross, and they were saying that that has kind of happened with Cash. You know, have a sector of expertise, and really we want to integrate this into all the other areas. So let's not replicate challenges there. Let's get it right first time around. That's it from my side.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Ben. That was a great session. We'll take a lot from that, and it leaves me basically only with saying, first, you can see here QR code. There's a little evaluation. There's also a last question for all the inputs that you wanted to give but did not do yet. So please check it out and see that you can fill it. We will do our job as the core group of the Grand Bargain. We'll take on all of that input that you gave to us. We took notes of what we have been hearing now. We have all our material there. So that will all be discussed. We promised that to you. So it was a very useful and fruitful session for us. I hope for you as well. And that only leaves me with saying thanks to the Anticipation Hub for supporting that, Tim and Jesse online. Thanks for all the speakers that we had here in the room. Thanks for all the facilitation outside at the flip charts in person, and also our facilitation online. And also thanks to Hannes, who is behind a lot of the development and arranging and implementing of this session back there. So thanks to all of you. And now please go home.